As population geneticists, we could spend the next decade talking about this 2% ghost ancestry, but in practical terms, it doesn't matter. This stunning statement was made by Princeton geneticist Joshua Akey in 2016. What he is referring to is a 2% ghost ancestry, representing an early Eurasian lineage, which was first discovered in Papuans, but is found in all Eurasians and their offshoots. Now, a decade later, this 2% ghost ancestry still matters, but the implications of this information have been kept quiet. So why do geneticists downplay the early Eurasian 2% genetics? Not because it's small, but because of where it came from. It means all Eurasians and their offshoots in the Americas, Australia and North Africa carry ancestry from a ghost lineage. That is huge. In fact, this 2% is the conclusive evidence that there was never a single pure Garden of Eden population that had a sudden spark of intelligence and decided to leave Africa only 50,000 years ago, wipe out every other human group, and populate the entire world. What this information tells us is that Eurasians are 200,000 years old. That is evolutionary dynamite. And this 2% is one of the strongest arguments against simplistic models. It supports repeated expansions, extinct branches, ghost populations, and complexity rather than simplicity. This 2% early Eurasian comes from the same metapopulation as the school Kafsa early modern humans, but it is even older and located deeper in Arabia and the Persian Gulf basin. The 2% is not the same as basal Eurasians, which are a much younger population. Because this early Eurasian lineage split off and then was reabsorbed, Africa lost many ancient variants through later expansions, but the Proto-Eurasian population preserved some of them. Thus, some alleles in Eurasians and Papuans are older than modern African lineages. This 2% comes from a mysterious, unsequenced, long-extinct population of early Homo sapiens who lived between roughly 200,000 and 120,000 years ago. The only way for this ghost population to remain genetically distinct for 100,000 years is if they lived outside of Africa, in an isolated refugium, most likely in Arabia or the Persian Gulf basin. This is not speculation. This is what the genetics, archaeology and paleoclimate all independently suggest when combined. This is why Eurasians have alleles older than the out-of-Africa bottleneck, why certain Middle Eastern haplotypes are unusually ancient, and why Papuans have a stronger signal of this 2% early Eurasian. This is also why there was interbreeding with Neanderthals 200,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, and again 50,000 years ago, or there was almost constant interbreeding with Neanderthals from 250,000 to 50,000 years ago. The genetics are not that precise to know if these were separate events or a single continuous love fest. We know that these early Eurasians who interbred with Neanderthals were not failed migrations because they contributed genes to later Eurasians. They didn't migrate back into Africa, and then their descendants migrated back out again. They lived in Eurasia for 200,000 years. This is politically and academically uncomfortable, so the 2% is buried in supplementary information and not widely discussed. It was a population cloud with admixture, backflow, bottlenecks and extinctions. That is why population geneticists say it doesn't matter. But they are speaking from a technical viewpoint, not an evolutionary viewpoint. According to textbooks, documentaries, and even Nobel-winning geneticists, all modern humans descend from a single, clean evolutionary event. A small group of anatomically modern humans left Africa about 70,000 years ago and replaced everyone else. This strict out-of-Africa model became so politically, culturally, and scientifically dominant that questioning it is treated almost like questioning evolution itself. But buried inside the genomes of every Eurasian person on Earth lies a secret. It is small, only 2%, but it is enough to demolish the idea that modern humans came from a single homogeneous tribe. It is enough to reveal that the exodus from Africa was not a single clean story, but a tangled tapestry of earlier expansions, failed dispersals, extinctions, bottlenecks, and remixing among populations that lived both inside and outside Africa long, long ago, and scientists rarely talk about it, not because it is scientifically controversial, not because it is wrong, but because this 2% proves that the traditional out-of-Africa model is deeply flawed. It adds complexity where simplicity once reigned. It suggests that the ancestors of modern humans were themselves already hybrids of multiple ancient Homo sapiens lineages before they ever stepped foot in Eurasia. This 2% comes from early Homo sapiens who lived roughly 200,000 in a corridor stretching into Arabia and the Persian Basin during warm climate windows. They were not archaic humans. They were Homo sapiens, yet genetically distinct from the ancestors of modern Africans and modern Eurasians alike. They represent an early expansion of modern humans into Eurasia, long before the famous migration around 70,000 years ago. This group later vanished, leaving only a faint echo of its DNA in the population that ultimately became the founders of all Eurasian-descended people. That faint echo is the 2%, a genetic fossil of a vanished people. And although geneticists acknowledge it quietly in supplementary tables and in technical discussions of ancestral population structure, it never reaches the public narrative because it complicates the tidy idea that humanity once had a single pure origin. To understand the significance of this ghost population, one must first understand what happened in Arabia during the warm interglacial, roughly 100 to 120,000 years ago. In this window, the climate of the eastern Mediterranean was humid, rivers flowed across what is now desert, and the Sinai Peninsula was green enough to allow the free movement of animals and humans between Africa and Eurasia. It is in this environment that modern humans of extraordinary anatomical sophistication appeared at the famous sites of School and Kafse. Their remains are unmistakably Homo sapiens, rounded crania, delicate brow ridges, chins and facial proportions far more similar to modern humans than to Neanderthals. Yet School and Kafse are older than the classic out-of-Africa dispersal by more than 50,000 years. They belong to an early wave of modern humans that moved into Arabia during a wet climatic window, only to collapse or retreat when glacial conditions returned. Archaeologically, they seem to represent a brief occupation, perhaps a few thousand years before Neanderthals reoccupied the region. For decades, scientists assumed these early humans left no descendants. They were described as a failed dispersal. But the discovery of the 2% suggests something else. That these people, or populations closely related to them, did not vanish entirely. They left a genetic trace that later merged with the ancestors of all modern Eurasians. Modern genome studies have confirmed that this 2% is not European, not Asian, and not African. It clearly diverges from African populations earlier than the main out-of-Africa event, yet it is closer to Homo sapiens than Neanderthals or Denisovans. The best fit for its origin is a population that lived outside Africa, but before the major expansion of modern humans into Eurasia. Imagine a chain of communities spread into Arabia during humid phases. They hunted gazelle and ibex. They gathered shellfish and used Levallois points hafted onto wooden shafts. They processed ochre. They crafted symbolic beads. They lived in small bands, too small to endure long-term population pressure, but large enough to leave their mark genetically. These people were modern humans in every sense except one. They lived tens of thousands of years before the ancestors of today's Europeans, Asians and Papuans. When the climate dried and deserts expanded, these early humans either retreated into Africa or dwindled in Arabia, but not before a small amount of their DNA flowed back into the populations living along the Red Sea and Nile corridor. Then came the Great Bottleneck, the moment around 70,000 years ago when a small, isolated group of modern humans, perhaps only a few thousand individuals, formed the population that would eventually colonize the entire world. This founder population was not genetically pure or homogeneous. It already contained multiple ancient signals, including the 2% ghost ancestry from these earlier Arabian or Red Sea populations. That means that even before Neanderthals contributed their 2%, even before humans walked into Arabia in the final wave, the ancestors of all Eurasians were already a hybridization of deeply diverged Homo sapiens branches. This is the part scientists dislike discussing publicly. The 2% ghost ancestry proves that modern humans were not a single unified lineage at the moment of the Great Expansion. Instead, the founding population of Eurasia was formed by the fusion of at least two different Homo sapiens lineages, one from inside Africa and one from just outside it. This alone destroys the textbook picture of out of Africa as a single clean migration from a single small tribe. The model becomes a multi-layered, messy, complex story involving repeated dispersals and reabsorptions, human movements back and forth, and ancient substructure that persisted for tens of thousands of years. Ironically, it was Dr. Akey who admitted that geneticists had made a mistake when they made the assumption that Africans did not have any Neanderthal DNA and so didn't test for it until 2020. This meant that the Neanderthal contribution to Eurasians was underestimated for a decade.
And that's because all of the methods up until this point have assumed that Neanderthal ancestry in Africa was either very little or non-existent. And so we recently developed a new method that didn't make this assumption. And so we were excited to apply it to individuals of African ancestry.
So if they missed this, then what else are they not testing for because they assume it doesn't exist? This 2% also explains why the genetic differences between Africans and Eurasians are not simply the product of the 70,000-year migration. Some alleles common in Eurasians are older than the out-of-Africa bottleneck and yet absent in Africans. These alleles certainly come from the ghost population. They are not modern African alleles. They are deep Homo sapiens variants carried into Eurasia in an early dispersal and lost in Africa due to later demographic turnover. That means Eurasians preserve ancient diversity that Africa itself later lost. It also means that the out-of-Africa story is not about a single, pure, Adam and Eve-like founder population. Instead, the story involved people who were already genetically mixed, already complex, and already representing multiple branches of humanity. The 2% is small, but significant. It changed the architecture of the Eurasian genome, influencing allele frequencies across everything from immune genes to keratin structure to regulatory elements involved in neurodevelopment. It did not introduce radically different traits, as Neanderthal DNA did. Instead, it shifted the baseline, adding strands of very ancient African diversity that became embedded in the entire Eurasian population. Today, researchers acknowledge this only in technical terms. They call it deep population structure, a weakly divergent lineage, a pre-bottleneck contribution, or early modern human expansion poorly represented in Africa. But they rarely describe it plainly, that all Eurasians carry a small amount of DNA from a vanished Eurasian population that lived outside Africa long before the famous migration. They do not say aloud that this contradicts the public narrative of a single out-of-Africa wave. They almost never connect this ghost ancestry to the archaeology of School and Kafse, because that would imply that these early modern humans are part of the ancestry of Europeans after all. When you combine this with Neanderthal ancestry, Denisovan ancestry, and basal Eurasian ancestry, the picture becomes even more complex. The founders of Eurasia emerge as a composite population assembled from multiple lineages, some inside Africa, some just outside it, some archaic, some deeply ancient and long vanished. The simplified version of human evolution taught to the public that all humans descend from a single tiny tribe that left Africa in one pulse is no longer defensible. The genetic evidence is unmistakable. Modern humans were always more complicated than that. This undermines the idea of a single origin within Africa and a single exit from it. Instead, it points to a species that ranged widely across Africa and Arabia long before the final dispersal, interacting, hybridizing, splitting and rejoining in ways that left faint but crucial signatures in the genomes of everyone alive today. The 2% is the key to seeing this truth. Hidden within that tiny fraction of DNA is the memory of a lost people, those early modern humans who walked Arabia long before the final migration, who left behind beads and ochre and elegantly crafted points, who may have met Neanderthals on the slopes of Mount Carmel, who thrived in a green, fertile world now buried under desert. Their lineage did not survive, but a fragment of their genome persists in every child from Europe to India to Australia as a whisper from a forgotten chapter of human evolution. Anyone who says that there is a scientific consensus about the origin of modern humans is spreading disinformation. Consensus is manufactured by the control of funding and peer review. There has never been a global survey asking scientists to anonymously answer if they agree on every point of human evolutionary theory. So, when one of the top geneticists in the world says we aren't talking about this 2% because it doesn't matter, it is a massage to other geneticists to keep this information hidden from the public. Thanks for watching.